In 1332, church records confirm something that was supposed to be impossible. A woman sealed alive inside a wall for life had gotten out. It records a woman named Christine, sealed permanently into a stone cell, attached to her church in Shere, England, and closed for life, by her own request. 3 years later, the same register records something the ritual was never supposed to allow. She was gone. The church called this enclosure a living burial. The record calls it a disappearance. You've probably heard the version of this story, where medieval women were locked away against their will, punished by a church that controlled every part of their lives. That version isn't wrong. You've seen it before on this channel. But Christine's case doesn't fit it. No one forced her into that cell.
This is my decision, Father.
She asked for it, petitioned for it, waited years for permission to be granted. And then, somehow, she got out of a life the entire ritual was built to make permanent. Everyone who's watched enough medieval history knows the story of women punished by confinement. Convents used as prisons, marriages used as sentences. Almost no one knows about the version of confinement women were begging to get into. And almost no one knows that at least one of them still found a way out. We don't know why Christine left. We don't know what happened to her afterward. The record simply stops. But to understand how a woman ends up sealed alive in a wall by her own choice, and what it would take to break out of a life literally built without a door, we have to go back to what these women were promised before they ever stepped inside. Before we go further, I want to address the obvious skepticism, because I had it too. Some historians argue rooms like this were simply storage crypts, reliquary chambers, nothing more. But storage rooms don't need a stone bench worn down by years of sitting in one place. They don't need a window angled precisely toward the altar. And they definitely don't need a second opening, built specifically low enough to pass food and water through. So if this wasn't storage, what was it? And why did the church go to such lengths to leave it out of the record? To answer that, I had to go back nearly 900 years, to the earliest surviving instructions for exactly this kind of enclosure. The first real clue isn't architecture, it's a document. It's called the Anchoresses, a 13th century guidebook, written specifically for women entering permanent religious enclosure. One translated line stopped me completely. "Beloved sisters, once you have entered, you shall not go out again, save by fire or extreme necessity." Not a metaphor, a literal instruction. You do not leave. The guide details what to eat, how to pray hour by hour, and this is the part that surprised me most: direct warnings about loneliness and doubt. It even addresses women who began to regret their decision, which raises an uncomfortable question. If this was purely devotion, why did the church need to prepare instructions for women who might want to leave? The paper trail only tells us what the church wanted these women to experience. To find out what actually happened inside those walls, I had to look at the evidence the church didn't design. This is where the design of these cells becomes the real evidence. Every documented anchor hold follows the same three-part structure. A squint window facing the altar, for hearing Mass. A second, larger opening facing outward to the town, for visitors. And a third, low opening, exactly like the one found in that 2019 discovery, for food and waste. That third opening is the detail most skeptics can't explain away. It isn't decorative, it isn't symbolic. It's a functional design choice that only makes sense if someone was expected to survive there for years, possibly decades. And that outward-facing window tells us this wasn't total isolation. Village records from Norwich describe townspeople visiting a woman at the wall for guidance. Farmers, grieving mothers, even nobility. A woman with no home, no husband, and no legal identity somehow held more standing in her community than almost anyone else in it. Here's where it gets stranger. Norwich's parish records list two different women's names, attached to what appears to be the exact same cell, decades apart. Which means whatever happened in that room happened more than once, and the church kept allowing it to happen. To understand why the church allowed this, we have to look at how a woman actually entered one of these cells, because the ceremony itself tells us how seriously this practice was taken. Witnesses described it as almost indistinguishable from a funeral. The priest read the office of the dead, the same rites spoken over a corpse, while the woman stood there, fully alive, listening to her own funeral. In some accounts, she was made to lie on the floor of the church, covered with a funeral cloth, as a symbolic death before her real burial into the wall. Then came the ceiling itself, brick by brick, sometimes finished with mortar, thick enough that reopening the cell would have meant breaking through solid stone. This wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was built to be permanent. Which brings up an obvious question. Why would a bishop, a man responsible for the spiritual well-being of his diocese, agree to perform what amounted to a funeral for someone who wasn't dying? Surviving correspondence between bishops and their dioceses gives us part of the answer, and it's more complicated than I expected.
It is approved.
Some letters describe bishops actively encouraging enclosure, treating it as one of the highest spiritual achievements a woman in their diocese could reach. Other letters tell a very different story.
But not every petition.
One surviving record from a 14th century diocese shows a bishop denying a woman's first petition entirely, citing concerns about her steadiness of purpose. She reapplied 3 years later. That second petition was granted. That detail matters because it tells us this wasn't automatic. Bishops were making judgment calls, evaluating who they believed could survive this life and who they thought might break under it. Which means somewhere in a diocese archive we haven't fully searched, there may be records of women who were refused permanently. Women who wanted this life and were never allowed to have it. The clearest window we have into what this life actually felt like comes from one specific woman. Because unlike almost every other Anchoress in the historical record, we know her by name. In the spring of 1373, Julian of Norwich fell so ill that her family believed she was dying. A priest was called to perform last rites, holding a crucifix in front of her face so it would be the final image she saw. She didn't die. According to her own account, she experienced a series of 16 visions during her illness. Vivid, overwhelming, and almost impossible to fully put into words. She recovered. And here's the detail most retellings skip past. She didn't become an Anchoress out of grief or punishment or family pressure. She specifically requested enclosure afterward in order to have the silence and uninterrupted time to understand what she'd experienced and to write it down. What she produced is called Revelations of Divine Love. Historians consider it the earliest surviving book written in English by a woman, not the earliest religious text by a woman, not the earliest work by a nun, the earliest surviving book in the English language written by a woman, full stop. Most Anchoresses who wrote left nothing behind. Their work was lost to fire, neglect, or simple indifference over the centuries. Julian's survived almost by accident, passed hand to hand through a small number of readers who happened to preserve it. Centuries before, women could own property, vote, or attend university. One of them was sealed behind a wall exactly like the one uncovered in 2019, and wrote something still being read 650 years later. Which brings me to the piece of evidence that made me question everything I thought I understood about why women chose this life in the first place. Fragments of the actual petition letters women submitted to bishops still survive in a few diocese archives, and they don't all read the same way. Some are unmistakably devotional. One reads, roughly translated, as an outpouring of gratitude and certainty about God's calling. Others are shorter, flatter. One surviving fragment from a 14th century diocese simply states, "She has no husband, no dowry, and no place remaining to her." That's not a request built on spiritual calling. That's a request built on there being no other option left, which means the exact same ritual, the exact same sealed wall, may have meant something completely different, depending on which woman was standing in front of it. For Julian, it may have been a door she genuinely chose. For others, it may have been the only door still open to her. This is the part of the story the Anchoresses itself doesn't shy away from, and it's worth sitting with. The guidebook includes direct passages addressing despair, instructing Anchoresses on how to manage the days when isolation became unbearable, when doubt crept in, when the walls felt less like sanctuary and more like exactly what they physically were. It even offers guidance for women who wanted to leave, despite having no legal way to do so. That tells us something the ceremonies and petitions don't. The Church understood this wasn't universally peaceful. They were sealing away women who had made a choice, and who might still suffer under the weight of it every day that followed. Some Anchoresses lived 40, 50 years behind their walls, and left no record of regret at all. Others, we can only assume from the guidebook's own warnings, did not fare as well, and their names, unlike Julian's, didn't survive to tell us. So let's go back to that sealed chamber found in 2019. If a room like that could sit undocumented in a church's own archive for centuries, it raises a question that extends far beyond one building. How many other anchor holds are still sealed inside walls nobody has thought to check? How many names like Julian's simply never survived at all? This isn't only a story about medieval devotion. It's a story about how much of women's history was built to be erased by design, and how much of it survived anyway, by accident, inside a wall nobody thought to open. I've linked the translated Anchoresses passages and the Norwich parish records in the pinned comment. Read them yourself, and tell me, do you think this was devotion, or the only escape a woman in that world was ever allowed to have? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to see where this investigation goes next, there's another sealed wall I've been looking into. This one, nobody asked to enter.